Welcome to the deep dive. Now, when we talk about the American Civil War, often, the focus is on the big picture stuff, the huge battles, the grand strategies, the sort of moral causes. We tend to look at it from a distance.
Yeah, exactly. But today, we're doing something different. We're putting away that telescope and grabbing, let's say, a microscope.
Okay.
We're stepping past the monuments, really, and getting into the grit, using some fascinating analysis of what soldiers actually wrote their letters, diaries, memoirs. We're focusing mostly on those early volunteers, the ones from 61 and 62.
Right, the ones who signed up with all that initial enthusiasm. And our goal here, our mission, is to really trace the tough adaptation these men went through. We want to see how their ideas about courage, about honor, even about just staying alive, were completely smashed and then rebuilt over 4 really brutal years. So where do we start? What were these guys thinking when they first signed up?
Well, if you look at that 1861 volunteer, their whole world, morally speaking, seemed to revolve around just one main idea: courage. Yeah, the sources make it really clear. Courage wasn't just, a good trait for a soldier. It was everything. It was basically the same thing as manhood. They used the words almost interchangeably.
So if you lacked courage, you weren't just a bad soldier, you were somehow less of a man.
Precisely. Combat was seen as the absolute test. There was no avoiding it. And you see this weight in their writings. There's one Union officer, for example, who was just terrified at Antietam, and he apologized later saying he felt completely unmanned.
Wow, unmanned.
Yeah. That cultural pressure made feeling fear, which is totally natural, incredibly shameful, something you suffered alone.
And tied right into that courage was this idea of honor, right? This
Yeah.
kind of assumption that even in this incredibly bloody war, it was still going to be fought between gentlemen.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very almost Victorian ideal, maybe even a bit medieval. They literally went into battle thinking about having an honorable death.
An honorable death.
Or, second best, an honorable wound. Think about Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., future Supreme Court Justice. After he was wounded early on, he wrote about feeling this joyful pride, just thinking he might die a soldier's death.
That just sounds so alien to how we think about war now.
Yeah.
Nothing like the World War II idea of the $1 million wound that gets you safely home.
Completely different mindset. It shows how much the context of how you died or were wounded mattered. And this gentlemanly ideal, this trust, it was incredibly important even between enemies. It was the whole basis for the prisoner exchange system, the parole system.
Okay, give us an example of that parole system, because it sounds almost naive given what was happening on the battlefields.
Well, take Captain Edward Hastings Ripley and his men. Union soldiers captured early. They were let go just on their promise, their word of honor not to fight again until they were officially exchanged.
Just their word.
Just their word. And these guys had to wait 6 months at Camp Douglas, which was a terrible place, disease-ridden, awful conditions, just because they'd given their word.
They had to endure that rather than break their promise.
Yes. And the expectation went both ways. Even after Gettysburg, Confederate General Pickett actually ordered Union officers who'd been paroled to report themselves to Richmond for prison if the exchange hadn't happened by a specific date.
He expected them to just turn themselves in.
And there was no sense that this was unreasonable. It was just honor. Even interrogating prisoners was sort of polite. General Sheridan was questioning a captured Confederate captain, and the captain just said, "Why, General, I cannot answer those questions."
And shared it.
Sheridan immediately backed off, said something like, "No, but I thought I would ask them." The enemy was still seen as someone who deserved, honorable treatment.
That reliance on trust is really something.
Yeah.
But okay, if these volunteers started out defining courage as being totally fearless and manhood as this kind of knightly honor, how fast did that fall apart when they actually got into the reality of camp life? What was the first thing to go?
Oh, it crumbled almost immediately. And it started with that psychological shock we talked about. This idea that fear was unacceptable meant soldiers felt their terror completely alone, silently.
Right.
That isolation, mixed with just the practical realities of war, it just crushed those initial ideals very quickly.
You really see that practical side when you look at what they tried to bring with them, don't you?
Yeah.
They packed like they were going on some grand adventures/family picnic.
Yeah, the sources are great on this. George Allen's list is amazing. Tons of underwear, a photo album, special water filters, even cold meats, pie, and cake sent from home.
Seriously. Pies.
Yes, these packs weighed like 60, 70, even 80 pounds. totally impossible. So the first long marches forced them to start ditching things, and it was painful shedding those items that reminded them of home. They had to get down to the absolute basics. Rifle, poncho, maybe some hardtack and coffee.
So they weren't just losing gear, they were kind of losing that tangible connection to their old lives. And the camps themselves, they weren't exactly places of inspiration, were they? More like drudgery.
Monotony and disease. Those were the real enemies early on, maybe even more than the Confederates, for some. Soldiers wrote constantly about the boredom. Bugles, drums, drills, parades, the old story over and over again.
Sounds soul-crushing.
It was. And physically dangerous. They described men dying like rotten sheep from dysentery, typhoid, measles. This environment wasn't just physically unhealthy, it was seen as morally weakening, too.
How so?
Well, soldiers started turning to drinking, gambling, swearing, vices. Not really because of battle stress yet, but just to escape the sheer crushing boredom and stagnation. You see guys like Theodore Upson writing home, feeling guilty because he'd started smoking and swearing, things his family disapproved of.
And if you got sick or wounded, the hospital wasn't exactly a refuge either, was it? It sounds like it demanded its own kind of brutal stoicism.
Absolutely. The test of courage didn't stop if you got hit. In the hospital, you entered what they called the harder heroism. Courage there meant absolute stoicism. No complaining, even if you were facing agony, amputation, lockjaw.
That sounds unbearable.
And the staff, the nurses, the surgeons, they enforced it. Mary Livermore, who worked for the Sanitary Commission, actually recalled telling a screaming, dying soldier, quite bluntly, "Stop screaming. If you must die, die like a man and not like a coward." The expectation was just utter control. Right to the end.
Wow. That level of just bottling everything up seems like it couldn't last. Especially as the war itself changed, right? As it became less about individual bravery and more about, well, industrial killing. Did that ideal of the gentleman soldier survive the technological changes?
Not really. The big shift technologically was the widespread adoption of the rifle instead of the old smoothbore musket.
What was the difference?
Range, mostly. A smoothbore was only really effective out to maybe 100 yards. A rifle, you're talking 400 yards, maybe more. That completely changed the battlefield calculus. The charge, that heroic, dashing charge that was supposed to win battles, quickly suddenly became incredibly, horrifically costly.
So the knightly ideal of charging into glory basically became a death sentence, which suggests, maybe, that the new hero wasn't the guy charging forward, but the guy digging in.
Exactly that. The shovel, the spade. Initially, soldiers and even some generals looked down on it. It was seen as an ignoble weapon. McClellan got criticized for being too cautious, too reliant on digging.
But reality changed their minds.
Fast. Battles like Shiloh and definitely by Fredericksburg and later Cold Harbor hammered home the lesson. Victory often went to the side that was dug in. Facing intense rifle fire quickly converted regiments to digging with alacrity and enthusiasm, as one source puts it. Entrenching became almost second nature.
So digging in wasn't cowardly anymore. It was smart. It was courageous in a new way.
Yes. They actually decided it was not in the least inconsistent with the highest development of personal courage. The definition shifted.
That's a huge mental shift. The measure of bravery wasn't just about charging anymore, but about knowing when not to charge.
It's a profound paradox of that war, and it came with a grim understanding. The bravest guys, the ones who followed the old code, the ones who went farthest and stand longest under fire, as one officer lamented, they were the ones getting killed disproportionately.
So the best officers, the most dedicated soldiers, were being weeded out by their own bravery.
Precisely. Real courage started to look more like collective preservation, like having the wisdom and the leadership willing to avoid certain slaughter.
And the ordinary soldiers recognized this change. They appreciated leaders who didn't send them on suicide missions.
Oh, absolutely. There's a fantastic example near the end of 1863 at a place called Mine Run. General Meade had planned this huge assault, but he looked at the Confederate defenses, realized how strong they were, and called it off at the last minute.
How did the troops react?
They didn't complain about missing out on glory. They cheered. They celebrated the withdrawal like it was a major victory because it showed leadership that valued their lives, leadership that had the moral courage to say no to a pointless bloodbath. They were learning survival required a ruthless kind of pragmatism.
Okay, so if the tactics and the definition of courage on the ground were changing so drastically, it makes sense that the overall command philosophy had to change too, right? Did you see a shift in the type of general who became prominent?
Definitely. There was a noticeable move away from what some historians call the conservator generals, think McClellan, maybe guys who really tried to minimize casualties, keep the army intact, maybe win through maneuver.
And who replaced them?
They were replaced by the destroyer generals, guys like Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, and Stonewall Jackson on the Confederate side. They embraced a much, much harsher logic. The old gentlemanly respect for the enemy, that was largely gone.
What was the destroyer logic then?
Jackson summed it up pretty brutally. Shoot the brave officers and the cowards will run away and take the men with them. It was about breaking the enemy's will and capacity to fight through sheer destruction and attrition.
And Sherman famously took that even further.
He did. Sherman basically developed a philosophy of total war. He said things like, war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. And he believed war followed its own inevitable laws, like the thunderbolt.
His justification was that making war more terrible would make it end faster, right? A chilling sort of efficiency.
Exactly. It was a way to rationalize actions, widespread destruction, targeting civilian resources that the idealistic volunteers of 1861 would have found completely dishonorable. And this new, harsher reality created a huge gap, a real disconnect, between the soldiers at the front and the civilians back home.
Civilians who were still, presumably, talking about the war in those old, heroic terms.
Largely, yes. Soldiers started feeling deeply alienated from the home front. They felt people back home just couldn't understand what they were going through. This led to real resentment, especially towards patriotic speeches and moral oversight from people who weren't facing the bullets.
You mentioned James Connolly.
Right, an Illinois soldier who said he'd rather listen to the enemy's cannon fire Bragg's cannonade than listen to another civilian speech urging them to stand by the flag. The words just rang hollow compared to the sound and feel of actual combat.
It sounds like some soldiers almost wanted the war to touch the home front more directly, just so people would understand.
That feeling was definitely there. Some Union soldiers wrote about wishing the Confederates would raid up north, into Pennsylvania maybe, just to make the folks back home realize the necessity of crushing the enemy.
Wow. And home itself must have started to feel strange, distant.
It became this kind of unreal world. It was still cherished as a memory, this pure place, like Captain Ripley remembering his family's dining room stove, almost like a dream. But there was frustration, too. Civilians were worrying about soldiers maybe picking up bad habits, like swearing or drinking.
While the soldiers were dealing with, as one put it, dismemberment and death.
Exactly. The concerns seemed completely out of scale.
So, with those older values crumbling, and the connection to home feeling stretched and unreal, where did these soldiers find any kind of emotional anchor? What kept them going?
They turned inward, to each other. Comradeship became everything. The small group you marched with, ate with, slept near your mess, that became your little family.
Was it just practical, like you needed buddies to help you if you got hit?
That was a huge part of it, absolutely. It was a pragmatic insurance policy in combat. But it was more than that. It became the primary emotional refuge. As all the other ties to home, to those early ideals, to the nation in some abstract sense began to fray, the bond with the men next to you became incredibly intense. Some soldiers even described that fellowship as becoming almost a religion.
A replacement for the structures the war had torn down.
In a way, yes. It was the last reliable connection in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic and dangerous.
It's clear this whole journey, this adaptation, took a massive emotional toll. The sources you looked at, they describe a kind of final disillusionment, don't they? A sense of just being caught in something beyond their control.
Yeah, that feeling comes through really strongly in the later war writings. A sense of resignation, almost a paralyzing disbelief, as one historian put it. Soldiers felt less like active participants and more like objects just being carried along by this huge, destructive process towards their own disaster.
Did that affect how they thought about the future?
Profoundly. By 1864, 1865, many soldiers apparently just stopped saving money, stopped making plans. Why bother? The future felt like a total blank. They'd adapted to survive the day-to-day horror, but the original meaning, those high ideals they started with, those were mostly gone, replaced by endurance.
Which makes the post-war situation even more poignant. Because when these exhausted, disillusioned veterans finally came home, society didn't really want to hear about that war, did they?
No, society, by and large, needed to hear about the war they thought had been fought. The war of noble causes, unwavering courage, and honorable sacrifice. The idealized version of 1861.
So the veterans' actual experience was kind of pushed aside.
To a large extent, yes. Even the leaders of the big veterans organizations, like the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, they understood this. They knew that to get public support, pensions, monuments, they had to speak about the war in ways that were palatable, congenial.
Meaning they had to focus on the heroic parts and downplay the rest.
Right. They focused on the heroic dead, the self-sacrificing courage, the unity, the victory. They essentially had to reinforce the 1861 narrative and suppress the much harsher, more complex, and frankly more traumatizing memories of 64 and 65.
So here's the final, really stark paradox then. The very values these men initially fought for, that intense code of courage and honor, were effectively destroyed by the war they fought. But then, to be accepted and honored by society after the war, they had to pretend those shattered values were still intact. They had to embrace the myth that their own experience had proven false.
It's a deeply ironic and, frankly, tragic end to their journey.
It really makes you think. As you reflect on the Civil War, maybe consider not just the battles and the politics, but this immense unseen cost, the psychological and moral journey these ordinary soldiers endured, and the difficult silence that often followed.